It was one of those perfect Saturday mornings that made you want to open every window in the house and let the sunshine in. The air was warm but not hot, and the faint smell of fresh-cut grass carried through the neighborhood. Birds were chirping somewhere nearby, and a lawnmower buzzed faintly in the distance. It was the kind of day that felt made for being outside. Across the quiet suburban street, cars were already parked neatly along the curb, and the sound of friendly chatter floated from a driveway that was busier than usual. The owner of the house, a tall, quiet man in his late 40s named David, was setting up folding tables covered with old books, kitchenware, garden tools, and children's toys. A few signs with bright red letters reading, "Yard Sale," all proceeds to local charity, were posted on each corner of the street. David moved carefully, placing each item where it could be easily seen. He'd been planning this sale for weeks. After years of working long hours and moving from one city to another, he had collected more things than he needed. But this wasn't just about cleaning up his home. It was about helping others. The small town's veteran support group was short on funding this season, and he had quietly decided to donate all profits to them. He didn't make a big deal about it. He wasn't the type who liked attention. Neighbors began to wander over with coffee mugs in hand, smiling and chatting. Some brought their kids, who ran around the driveway pointing at toys and stuffed animals. The atmosphere was cheerful and relaxed. David greeted everyone warmly, cracking light jokes and helping people carry their purchases. Everything seemed perfect until the front door across the street opened. Out stepped the one person everyone in the neighborhood had learned to avoid, the president of the Homeowners Association. She was known for her sharp voice, her clipboard, and her habit of quoting HOA rules like they were sacred law. Her name was Linda, but behind her back most neighbors referred to her as the HOA lady, or when they were frustrated, Karen. Linda stood on her porch for a long moment, squinting toward David's yard. Her lips tightened as she took in the sight of folding tables, colorful signs, and cars parked along the curb. She didn't look pleased. David noticed her watching, but didn't think much of it. He'd already looked over the HOA guidelines before planning the sale. There was no clear rule against holding a one-day yard sale, especially when it was for charity. And besides, he'd gone the extra mile by getting a small event permit from the city, just to be safe. Still, Linda's glare didn't fade. She crossed her arms, sighed loudly enough for people across the street to hear, and finally started walking toward him. David smiled politely when she reached the driveway. "Morning, Linda," he said in a friendly tone. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" She didn't return the smile. "What exactly is going on here, David?" she asked, her tone sharp and formal like a teacher scolding a student. "Just a little yard sale," he said, trying to clear out some stuff and raise money for the veterans group downtown. "Would you like to take a look? There's some great books and—" Linda cut him off with a raised hand. "Yard sales are not permitted without prior approval from the HOA, she said. "You can't just set up shop like this. It's against community guidelines." A few neighbors nearby went quiet, pretending to look through a box of dishes while listening closely. David stayed calm. "Actually," he said gently, "I checked the bylaws. There's nothing that says residents can't hold a one-day sale. I even got a city permit just in case." Linda frowned. "City permits don't override HOA rules," she snapped. "We have a certain standard to maintain here. All this traffic, the signs, the clutter, it looks unprofessional. People are parking on both sides of the street." He looked around. Cars were parked neatly and not blocking any driveways. Children were laughing and neighbors were smiling. It was hard to see what she was so upset about. "Linda," he said softly, "it's for charity. I'm not keeping a dime, and everything will be cleaned up by this afternoon." But she wasn't listening. "That's not the point," she said. "If everyone started doing whatever they wanted, this neighborhood would turn into chaos. There are rules for a reason." Her voice was getting louder and people were starting to stare. David could feel the attention shifting toward them. "Look," he said, still calm, "I'm not trying to cause trouble. It's just one day. You're welcome to stop by later if you'd like to see how much we raise. The veterans group could use the help." Linda's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about charity. It's about following the rules. And you're setting a bad example." She glanced around as if looking for someone to agree with her, but most of the neighbors avoided eye contact. "I'm going to make a call," she said coldly. Before David could respond, she turned sharply and marched back toward her house. He sighed quietly, trying not to let it bother him. He'd dealt with people like her before, people who got caught up in power and control. He wasn't angry. He just felt sorry for her. One of the neighbors, a middle-aged woman holding a stack of cookbooks, leaned closer and whispered, "Don't mind her. David, she just likes to feel important." David smiled. "I'll be fine," he said. "It's just a yard sale." But 10 minutes later, the faint sound of a police siren echoed from down the street. A few heads turned. A black and white patrol car slowly pulled up in front of David's house, lights flashing but no siren. Conversations faded. Even the kids went quiet. Linda was back on her porch, phone in hand, watching proudly as if she had just saved the neighborhood from disaster. The officers stepped out of the car, 2 of them, both looking relaxed but professional. They didn't seem tense, just cautious. David walked up to them calmly. "Morning, officers," he said. "Can I help you?" One of them nodded politely. "We got a call about an unauthorized event," he said. "Mind telling us what's going on?" David gestured toward the tables. "Just a small yard sale for charity. I have a city permit if you'd like to see it." He reached into his pocket and handed over a neatly folded paper. The officer unfolded it, scanned it, then nodded slowly. "Looks valid to me," he said. The other officer glanced around. "Seems peaceful. No noise, no blocked roads. Everyone looks happy." Before David could reply, Linda came hurrying over. "Officers!" she said in an overly cheerful voice. "Thank you for coming. This man is violating HOA policy. He's disturbing the peace and creating unnecessary traffic." The first officer turned toward her. "Ma'am, this is a city matter, not an HOA issue," he said politely. "As long as he has a permit and no one's in danger, he's within his rights." Linda frowned. "But I'm the HOA president. These are private community rules." The officer nodded patiently. "Yes, ma'am, but HOA rules aren't enforceable by police unless there's a safety concern." A murmur ran through the crowd of neighbors who had gathered. Some hid small smiles behind their coffee cups. Linda crossed her arms, clearly frustrated. "So you're just going to let him continue?" she asked. The officer gave a small shrug. "There's no reason not to, ma'am. Everything checks out." For a moment she looked stunned. Then her eyes darted toward David. "You think you're clever," she said quietly. "This isn't over." David didn't respond. He just smiled faintly and said, "You're welcome to join us. Linda, there's fresh lemonade over there." Her mouth tightened, and she spun around, marching back toward her house. The officers lingered for a moment. The first one handed back the permit and said with a small grin, "Sorry to bother you, sir. Some people just like to call things in." "No problem," David said. "You're just doing your job." As the officers turned to leave, one of them paused and looked at David a little longer. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, as if he'd seen him before. "You're not David H., right?" the officer asked, his tone shifting slightly. David looked surprised but nodded. "Yes, I am." The officer's expression softened immediately. "I thought so," he said, his voice filled with respect. "My brother told me about you. You were the one who helped organize that relief convoy during the flood last year, right?" David hesitated, a little uncomfortable with the attention. "I was part of it, yeah. Just helped coordinate supplies." The officer smiled. "Part of it? My brother said you led it. You saved a lot of people that week." A few neighbors who had been pretending not to listen exchanged surprised glances. David gave a modest shrug. "Just doing what I could. A lot of folks helped out." The officer nodded, clearly impressed. "Well, it's good to meet you in person. You've got nothing to worry about here. If anyone gives you trouble again, just give us a call." David thanked them and they returned to their car, still smiling as they drove off. As the sound of the engine faded, the yard slowly came back to life. Conversations restarted. The kids began laughing again. Someone clapped softly and others followed, turning it into a small round of applause. David raised a hand, embarrassed. All right, he said with a grin. "Let's get back to finding these treasures a new home." Laughter rippled through the group. People started browsing again, and the relaxed energy returned even stronger than before. From across the street, Linda's curtains twitched slightly, but she didn't come out again. By noon, the driveway was buzzing. People dropped off extra items to donate. A few even offered cash directly for the charity. The lemonade table turned into a mini refreshment stand run by a couple of neighborhood kids who proudly handed out cups for free. David's heart felt light. He hadn't planned for any of this attention. He just wanted to help in his own quiet way. Seeing everyone come together reminded him why he loved this community, even with its quirks, and even with people like Linda. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, David wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked around. His driveway was full of laughter, kindness, and small acts of generosity. It wasn't just about selling old stuff anymore. It had turned into something much bigger. Still, he couldn't help but notice the shadow of movement behind Linda's curtains. She was still watching. He wondered what she was thinking. Maybe she felt embarrassed. Maybe she was still angry. Or maybe, deep down, she was trying to understand why so many people seemed happy to ignore her rules for a single morning. Whatever the case, David decided not to dwell on it. He had things to do, people to thank, and a cause to support. He smiled to himself as he packed another bag of donated books for a customer. He didn't know it yet, but this small yard sale, the one that had caused so much unnecessary drama, was about to change the neighborhood in ways he couldn't imagine. And as the last customer of the morning walked away smiling, David glanced at the house across the street and whispered under his breath, half amused, half thoughtful, "She really doesn't know who I am." The rest of the morning went by smoother than David expected after the little scene earlier. The police had come, looked around and left with smiles. The neighbors had laughed about it and most people assumed that was the end of it. But David knew better. He had seen the look in Linda's eyes as she watched from her porch. She didn't like being told she was wrong, and she certainly didn't like being ignored. Still, David wasn't one to worry too much. He'd faced tougher situations in his life. A neighbor with too much free time wasn't going to ruin his day. By lunchtime, the yard sale had turned into a neighborhood event. A few people brought over sandwiches and snacks. Someone even played soft music from a Bluetooth speaker. The kids from the lemonade table were running back and forth with cups, proud of their business. It felt more like a block party than a yard sale. David looked around and smiled. It reminded him of the community he'd always wanted to live in. People laughing together, helping each other, and not worrying about small differences. Then, just when everything seemed perfect again, Linda stepped out of her house for the second time that day. She was holding her phone again, but this time she wasn't calling anyone. She was recording. Her face was serious, her mouth pressed into a tight line as she slowly walked down the sidewalk, filming the driveway, the tables, the cars, and even the people chatting. David saw her coming and sighed quietly. "Here we go again," he muttered under his breath. A couple of neighbors noticed too. One of them whispered, "She's recording us now?" Linda's voice carried across the street. "Just documenting violations," she said loudly, not looking up from her phone. "This will be submitted to the HOA board." David tried to stay calm. "Linda," he said in his usual polite tone, "you're welcome to record, but there's really nothing wrong happening here." She finally looked up at him, her eyes sharp. "You think you're clever," she said. "Just because the police didn't shut you down doesn't mean you're in the clear. I know people on the board who will not be happy about this circus." David kept his tone steady. "It's just neighbors spending time together. It'll all be cleaned up by evening." "Don't test me," she said. "The HOA has rules for a reason. We're not going to let people turn this community into a flea market." A couple of people standing nearby exchanged looks but stayed quiet. They didn't want to get dragged into another argument. David nodded once, deciding not to continue the conversation. "All right, Linda. Have a good day," he said simply and walked away. That only made her more frustrated. "You'll be hearing from the board," she shouted as she turned around. He just smiled faintly and went back to helping a young mother load a stroller into her car. By mid-afternoon, the tables were half empty. Most of the items had been sold or donated. People came and went in waves, chatting about everything from gardening tips to favorite coffee shops. Every now and then, someone would stop to thank David for organizing the sale. But even with the cheerful energy around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that Linda wasn't done yet. Every so often, he caught a glimpse of her pacing on her porch, still talking on her phone. It was around 3 o'clock when a silver SUV rolled into the neighborhood and stopped right in front of David's driveway. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a gray suit with a clipboard in hand. "Afternoon," the man said with a forced smile. "Are you the homeowner here?" David nodded slowly. "I am. Can I help you?" "I'm with the Homeowners Association," the man said, flipping open his clipboard. "I was informed of a possible violation regarding an unapproved event." David tried not to laugh. "You're kidding," he said. "The HOA actually sent someone down here?" The man didn't laugh. "We take community standards seriously, sir. The board received a complaint from the association president." David crossed his arms. "Let me guess, Linda?" The man cleared his throat, avoiding the name. "I can't discuss the source of the complaint, but I do need to assess the situation." A few neighbors were already watching. They pretended to keep browsing, but their eyes were fixed on the conversation. David gestured toward the tables. "You're welcome to take a look," he said calmly. "It's a one-day charity sale. I have a permit from the city, and everything will be gone in a couple of hours." The HOA representative nodded, jotting something down on his clipboard. "I see. And did you submit a request form to the HOA for approval?" "No," David said, "because there's no rule against it. I checked. The guidelines mention restrictions on commercial businesses, but this isn't that." The man hesitated. "Still, all events held on the property that draw outside visitors are supposed to be reviewed by the board." "That's not what the bylaws say," David replied. "Would you like to see a copy?" The man looked slightly uncomfortable. "That won't be necessary. I'll just note that there was no prior approval." David nodded slowly, realizing this wasn't about rules. It was about power. Someone wanted to make a point. "All right," he said. "You do what you need to do. I'll do the same." The man scribbled a few more notes, thanked him, and walked back toward his car. As he got in, David saw Linda standing on her porch again, watching closely. When she noticed David looking at her, she turned and went inside. He exhaled deeply. He could feel a bit of tension in his shoulders, but he wasn't angry. Mostly, he was tired of the nonsense. One of the older neighbors, who had been sitting in a lawn chair near the curb, looked up and said, "You handled that pretty well." David smiled faintly. "No point in arguing with people who just want to win." The man chuckled. "That's true. She's been like this for years. You're just the latest target." "I figured as much," David said. The rest of the afternoon passed without any more surprises. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky a soft orange. People began packing up their things and the tables started to clear. Kids were chasing bubbles across the yard, and laughter filled the air again. But just when David thought the day was finally over, a familiar car rolled down the street, another black and white police cruiser. The same two officers stepped out, looking a little puzzled to be there again. "Evening," one of them said with a faint grin. "We meet again." David raised an eyebrow. "Don't tell me she called you again." The officer nodded, clearly embarrassed. "I'm afraid so. We got another report of a disturbance and unauthorized gathering." David laughed softly. "Well, you can see the disturbance is a couple of kids blowing bubbles." The officer looked around, smiling. "Yeah, I think we'll survive this one." Linda's door opened and she came out again, her arms folded. "Officers, this has gone on long enough," she said sharply. "He's been hosting this all day. It's creating noise, traffic, and now there's trash on the street." The second officer looked at the street. It was spotless. "Ma'am," he said politely, "everything looks fine to me." "It's not fine," she said. "He's disrespecting community rules. You need to do something." The first officer sighed. "Ma'am, this is not a police matter. We already checked his permit earlier, and he's not breaking any laws. If you have an HOA issue, you'll need to take it up with your board." "I am the board," she snapped. "At least I represent it." The officer nodded patiently. "Then you already know this isn't our jurisdiction. We can't enforce HOA rules." Linda looked furious, her face turned slightly red. "So he just gets to ignore the rules? That's not fair." David spoke gently. "Linda, no one's ignoring anything. Everything's almost packed up. I'll be done in an hour." She glared at him. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think you can do whatever you want because everyone likes you." He didn't answer. He just kept stacking boxes, staying calm. The officers exchanged glances. One of them stepped closer to David and lowered his voice. "You've got the patience of a saint," he said quietly. David smiled. "You get used to it." The officer nodded and turned back to Linda. "Ma'am, unless there's a crime being committed, we're going to head out." She threw up her hands. "Fine, but I'll be filing a formal complaint with the HOA. David looked up at her. "You do what you need to do, Linda. Have a good evening." That last line seemed to push her over the edge. She turned and stomped back to her house, slamming the door behind her. The officers both exhaled at the same time. "Wow," one said. "She really doesn't like losing," David chuckled. "She just likes order. Maybe a little too much." The first officer nodded, then gave him a friendly pat on the shoulder. "You keep doing what you're doing. People like you make these neighborhoods worth living in." "Appreciate that," David said sincerely. The officers waved to a few neighbors and headed back to their car. The flashing lights disappeared down the street, leaving behind a calm silence. The crowd slowly thinned out. A few neighbors stayed to help David clean up. Tables were folded, boxes were packed, and the leftover items were loaded into the back of his truck to be dropped off at the donation center. By sunset, the driveway was spotless again. Only a few stray leaves and a faint chalk drawing from the neighborhood kids remained. As David locked his garage, he glanced toward Linda's house. Her curtains were drawn, but he could see the faint light of her television flickering inside. He didn't feel angry, just a little sad for her. She had spent the whole day fighting something that didn't need to be a fight. If she had just walked over with a smile instead of a clipboard, she might have actually enjoyed herself. As the sky turned dark and the crickets began to sing, David sat on his porch with a cold drink and watched the quiet street. The stress of the day was finally fading away. He thought about the police officers, about the way one of them had recognized him earlier. He thought about how small acts like hosting a yard sale could bring people together or pull them apart, depending on how you approach them. He smiled to himself. People often said life in a neighborhood was simple, but it wasn't. It was full of personalities, small dramas, and quiet acts of kindness that rarely made headlines. He didn't know it yet, but that day had started something. The yard sale had become a story everyone would talk about, not because of the argument, but because of what came after. Inside her house, Linda sat at her computer, typing a long email to the HOA board. Her fingers moved fast, full of frustration. She wrote about the noise, the traffic, and the lack of respect for community rules. But as she typed, she paused more than once. Something about the way the officers had spoken to David had unsettled her. Who exactly was he? She had lived across from him for almost a year, and yet she realized she didn't know much about him at all. He kept to himself, always polite, never loud or rude. People seemed to like him instantly. There had to be more to the story. She deleted half of what she had written, then stopped typing altogether. Outside, the night grew quiet. David finished his drink, turned off the porch light, and went inside. The house was still, filled with the faint smell of fresh coffee and cardboard boxes. He smiled softly to himself. Tomorrow, he'd take the remaining donations to the Veterans Center. Then he'd start preparing for work on Monday like nothing had happened. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. The neighborhood would never look at Linda or him the same way again. And though he didn't realize it, the story of the yard sale wasn't over yet. It was only the beginning of something much bigger that would soon ripple through every house on that quiet street. The next morning, the neighborhood was quiet again. The bright weekend energy had faded, replaced by the usual calm hum of suburban life. Sprinklers hissed across lawns, dogs barked in the distance, and the air smelled faintly of wet grass. David was up early. He liked mornings like this, quiet, steady, predictable. He carried 2 large boxes out to his truck, filled with leftover items from the yard sale that he planned to drop off at the Veterans Center later that day. His body felt a little tired from all the lifting and packing, but his mind was calm. As he loaded the last box, he looked around the street. A few neighbors waved as they got their mail or started their cars for work. Some of them smiled a little wider than usual. It seemed word about the yard sale and everything that had happened had spread. "Morning, David," one neighbor called out. "Heard the sale raised over $1,000 for charity." That's incredible. David smiled modestly. Yeah, people were generous. I didn't expect that much. You should be proud, the man said. That was the most fun this street has seen in years. Thanks, David said. It was nice seeing everyone together. But as he spoke, he noticed a familiar figure standing on her porch again. Linda. She wasn't shouting or pacing this time. She was just standing still, watching quietly, her arms folded. There was something different about her face today. Less anger, more thought. David gave her a small nod from across the street. She didn't wave back, but she didn't glare either. She just turned and went inside. He shrugged it off, climbed into his truck, and drove toward the Veterans Center. The drive took about 20 minutes, and with each passing block, his mood lifted. The Veterans Center sat on the edge of town, a small one-story building with a faded American flag hanging by the entrance. The parking lot was half full, and a couple of people stood outside chatting. When David walked in carrying the boxes, the woman at the front desk looked up and smiled. Good morning. What do we have here? Donations from a yard sale, he said. People were generous yesterday. All proceeds go to the center. Her eyes widened. Oh, wow, that's wonderful. We've been struggling with supplies lately. This will help a lot. She waved to a volunteer to come help him unload. As they carried the boxes to the back room, she asked, Didn't you organize that big relief convoy during the flood last year? David chuckled softly. That was a team effort. I just helped coordinate. Don't be modest, she said warmly. You kept things together when everyone else was panicking. We still have your picture up in the hallway. He smiled awkwardly. I didn't realize that. People remember, she said. You helped more than you know. After he finished unloading the boxes, she insisted on taking a photo to post on the center's Facebook page. He tried to decline, but she laughed and said, Too late. You're already famous around here. By the time he left, he was smiling. It wasn't about recognition. It was just good to see people being helped. When he got back home, though, there was a folded piece of paper taped to his door. At first, he thought it might be junk mail, but when he pulled it off and unfolded it, he saw the HOA letterhead at the top. His name was written neatly in the corner. Dear homeowner, it began. The HOA board will be holding a meeting this evening to discuss a possible violation regarding the event held on your property. Your attendance is required. He sighed quietly and sat down on the porch step. It wasn't a surprise, but it still made him shake his head. That evening, the community hall filled slowly with familiar faces. The HOA meetings were usually dull. Budget updates, landscaping plans, reminders about garbage bins. But tonight, the energy was different. People whispered quietly as they took their seats. Linda sat at the front table with two other board members. She looked serious, her hands folded neatly in front of her. When David entered, several neighbors nodded at him in support. One woman whispered, We've got your back. He smiled and took a seat near the front. After a few minutes, the meeting started. Linda cleared her throat and spoke in her usual clipped tone. This meeting has been called to address a concern regarding a recent event held without proper HOA approval. She didn't say his name, but everyone knew who she meant. David stayed quiet. Listening, Linda continued. While the event may have been well-intentioned, it drew non-residents into our community and created potential liability issues. We must maintain our standards and ensure that all future activities are properly approved. A man in the back raised his hand. With all due respect, Linda, it was a yard sale for charity. It didn't hurt anyone. Another woman spoke up. It actually brought the neighborhood together. We haven't seen people that friendly in years. Several people murmured in agreement. Linda straightened in her chair. That's not the issue. The issue is that we have procedures for a reason. Rules keep our neighborhood orderly. David finally spoke. Can I say something? Linda hesitated but nodded. Go ahead. He stood up slowly. I understand the rules, and I made sure to follow them as best I could. I got a city permit, kept everything clean, and ended the event on time. No one was disturbed, and the police confirmed that nothing illegal happened. That may be true, Linda said, but you still failed to seek HOA approval. He nodded. That's correct, because there's no rule requiring approval for one-day charitable events. I read the bylaws before planning it. There was a brief silence. The other two board members exchanged a look. One of them, a gray-haired man named Paul, flipped through a binder. Actually, he said, he's right. The bylaws only restrict ongoing business activity. There's nothing about one-time charity sales. A few people in the room clapped lightly. Linda frowned. Even so, it caused unnecessary attention. The police were called twice. David looked at her calmly. They came because you called them, not because there was a problem. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the room. Linda's face tightened. I'm not trying to embarrass anyone, David said gently, but we should be focusing on what matters, building a stronger community, not fighting over things that bring people together. There was a long pause. One of the older residents, a woman who'd lived there for decades, raised her hand. He's right. I've lived here 25 years. That yard sale was the first time. I met half the people on this street. It felt like a real neighborhood again. Others nodded and voiced agreement. The energy in the room shifted. Paul cleared his throat. It seems to me that this wasn't a violation. If anything, it was a positive event. Maybe we can take this as a lesson to update the guidelines to encourage more community engagement. More people clapped this time, louder. Linda looked down at her papers, clearly realizing she was outnumbered. Her voice softened slightly. Fine, she said. But we still need to document the incident properly. Document it however you like, Paul said with a shrug. But no penalties will be issued. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but it was clear to everyone that the real discussion was over. When it ended, people crowded around David, shaking his hand and thanking him. You handled that with class, one man said. I'd have lost my temper halfway through, David smiled. There's no point in fighting anger with anger. When most people had left, Linda remained seated at the table, shuffling her papers. David walked up to her. Look, he said quietly, I didn't mean to make you feel disrespected. I know you care about the neighborhood. She looked up, surprised. You do? Of course, he said. You put in a lot of time keeping things running. I can see that. But maybe sometimes rules can make us forget what they're meant for, helping people live peacefully together. Linda sighed. For the first time, she didn't look defensive. I suppose I can be a bit strict sometimes, he smiled. We all have our moments. There was a brief silence. Then she asked, You used to be in the service, didn't you? He nodded slowly. Yes, for over 20 years. That explains it, she said quietly. The officers seemed to know you. They spoke to you like... She hesitated. Like they respected you, David shrugged. We've crossed paths before. I used to help with emergency logistics for the city. When the floods hit last year, I coordinated the rescue routes. That's probably how they remembered me. Linda blinked. You were behind that? I remember seeing it on the news. They said someone organized food and supplies for the shelters. He nodded again, his tone humble. That was me, and a whole team of great people. We worked together. For a moment, she just stared at him. The same man she'd called the police on, the one she accused of breaking rules, had actually helped save lives in their own community. Her shoulders relaxed. I didn't know, she said softly. I thought you were being careless. I get it, he said kindly. You're used to being the one who keeps things in order. But sometimes order looks different than we expect. She looked down at her papers again, her voice quieter now. I suppose I owe you an apology. He smiled gently. You don't owe me anything. Just maybe a cup of coffee someday. She laughed lightly, the first real laugh he'd ever heard from her. Maybe I can manage that. As David turned to leave, she said, For what it's worth, the board could use someone with your experience. You should think about joining. He stopped, surprised. Me, on the HOA board? Why not, she said. You clearly care about people. Maybe you can help us find a better balance, he nodded slowly. I'll think about it. That night, as he walked home under the streetlights, the air felt lighter. He wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time since moving there, he felt truly connected to the people around him. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now greeting him with smiles. Kids waved from their bikes. Someone shouted, You're a local hero now. He laughed and shook his head. When he got to his porch, he looked across the street. Linda's lights were still on. For a moment, he wondered if she was writing another email or maybe just thinking about the conversation they'd had. Either way, he hoped it was the start of something different. Inside, he poured himself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The street was quiet again, peaceful. Sometimes, he thought, people only see a small part of who you are, the part that fits into their rules, their opinions, their expectations. But when they see the whole picture, everything changes. The next morning, he'd find a small note in his mailbox written in neat handwriting. It would simply say, "Thank you for reminding me what community really means. L." He'd smile when he read it, fold it carefully, and place it inside a drawer. The yard sale had started as something small, just a way to give back. But it had turned into something much bigger, a reminder that kindness, patience, and quiet strength could change more than rules ever could. And deep down, he knew the story wasn't over yet. The following week felt strangely calm. After everything that had happened, the yard sale, the police visit, the HOA meeting, the neighborhood seemed to breathe easier. David noticed small but clear changes. People smiled more. They waved when they passed each other. Even the kids playing on the sidewalk seemed louder and happier, their laughter carrying through the warm afternoon air. For the first time since he'd moved into that quiet suburban community, David felt like he was part of it. He spent most of his mornings tending his garden. The sun was gentle then, and the air smelled of soil and flowers. He didn't think about the argument anymore. He didn't think about Linda or the HOA letter. He just enjoyed the sound of birds and the rhythm of watering the plants. One afternoon, while he was trimming the bushes by the fence, he heard someone clear their throat behind him. When he turned around, Linda was standing there. She was holding a small plate covered with foil. Her expression was uncertain, not angry, not stern, but careful, like someone stepping on unfamiliar ground. "Hi," she said awkwardly. "Hi there," David said, setting the trimmer aside. "How are you?" "I'm fine," she said quickly. Then she paused. I brought you something." He raised an eyebrow. "You did?" She held out the plate. "It's lemon cake. I made it this morning. I figured since we didn't start off on the best foot, maybe we could try again?" David smiled warmly. "That's very kind of you." She seemed almost embarrassed. "Don't get too excited. It might not taste great." He laughed softly. "I'll take my chances." He peeled the foil back slightly and caught the scent of fresh lemon and sugar. "Smells amazing." "Good," she said, sounding relieved. "Would you like to come in?" he asked. "I was just making coffee." She hesitated, looking like she wanted to say no, maybe out of habit, but finally nodded. "All right, just for a minute." Inside, the house felt calm and cozy. It wasn't fancy, but everything was neat and organized. She looked around, clearly surprised by how warm it felt. "I didn't expect it to look like this," she said. "Like what?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "After the yard sale, I pictured chaos," he chuckled. "I like things tidy." "The military will do that to you." She smiled faintly. "I guess so." They sat at the small kitchen table, and David poured her a cup of coffee. The lemon cake turned out better than she'd warned. It was moist, soft, and slightly tart. "This is really good," he said. "You might have a hidden talent." She laughed a little shyly. "It's just a recipe my mother used to make." I hadn't baked it in years. They sat in silence for a few moments, sipping their coffee. It wasn't uncomfortable silence, more like the kind that exists between people figuring out how to start over. Finally, she said quietly, "You were right about what you said at the meeting. Rules are supposed to help people, not divide them." David glanced up, surprised by her honesty. "I appreciate that," she sighed. "You know, I've been on the board for almost 8 years. And in that time, it feels like all I've done is argue about garbage cans and fence colors. Somewhere along the way, I forgot why I joined in the first place." "Why did you join?" he asked. She looked down at her cup. "When I first moved here, this neighborhood was full of life. We used to have block parties, game nights, even cookouts. I loved that sense of belonging. But over time, people stopped showing up. They kept to themselves. I thought if I joined the board, maybe I could help bring that feeling back. But," she gave a small, tired smile, "I guess I turned into the opposite of what I wanted." David nodded slowly. "It happens. Sometimes we get so focused on keeping things perfect that we forget people don't live perfectly." She looked at him with genuine appreciation. "You're very patient, you know that?" He smiled. "I've had practice. Dealing with people under pressure for 20 years will teach you that." She laughed lightly. "You must think I'm impossible." "No," he said kindly. "I think you care a lot. You just show it differently." That seemed to mean something to her. She relaxed in her chair and took another sip of coffee. After a moment, she asked, Did you always live around here? No, he said. I moved a few years ago after retiring. I wanted some peace and quiet. Somewhere simple. Do you ever miss it? She asked. He thought for a moment. Sometimes. Not the noise or the stress, but the people. The feeling of purpose, Linda nodded. That's what I miss too. Feeling like what I do matters. It still can, he said gently. You just have to look for different ways to make it matter. They talked for nearly an hour. About life, the neighborhood, small things that didn't seem important but somehow were. When she finally stood to leave, the awkwardness between them was gone. Thank you for the coffee, she said, and for not holding a grudge. There's no grudge, he said. Just neighbors figuring each other out. She smiled and nodded. Maybe we can do more of that around here. After she left, David sat back at the table for a while, thinking. People were complicated, he thought. Sometimes the ones who caused the most trouble were just the ones who wanted to belong the most. Over the next few days, small changes began happening in the neighborhood, subtle but noticeable. One morning, David woke up to find a notice slipped under his door. It wasn't from the HOA this time. It was an invitation. Community gathering, Saturday afternoon. Everyone welcome, it read. Bring food, drinks, or just yourself. At the bottom, written in neat handwriting, were the words, Let's make this place feel like home again. L. He smiled. On Saturday, he walked over to the small park near the end of the street. There were folding tables lined up, covered with homemade dishes and drinks. Kids ran around with balloons, and neighbors who had barely spoken before were laughing together. It was exactly what Linda had talked about, the way things used to be. When she spotted him, she waved. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said. I wouldn't miss it, he said. She looked around, proud and a little emotional. Can you believe this? I haven't seen half these people in years, David nodded. You did this, she shook her head. No, you did. You reminded everyone what community means. They spent the afternoon talking to neighbors, eating too much food, and watching the kids play games. Someone brought out a speaker, and soon music filled the air. A few people even started dancing. At one point, a man from the HOA board stood up and raised his cup. Here's to David, he said, for turning a yard sale into a neighborhood again. Everyone clapped, and David laughed, feeling slightly embarrassed but happy. When the sun began to set, the sky turned gold and pink, and the streetlights flickered on one by one. People lingered long after they normally would have gone home. It felt like the beginning of something new. Later that night, as David walked back home carrying an empty dish, Linda caught up to him. Hey, she said softly. I was serious about what I said earlier. You'd be good on the board. We could use someone who actually listens. He smiled. I'll think about it. Promise? She said. I promise. As they reached his house, she hesitated and then said, You know, I used to think being right was the most important thing, but now I think being kind is harder. And more important, he nodded. Kindness usually is harder, but it lasts longer too. She smiled at that, then turned to head home. Good night, David. Good night, Linda. When he went inside, he set the empty dish on the counter and glanced out the window. Across the street, Linda was turning off her porch light. For the first time since he'd moved there, it didn't feel like he was living next to an enemy. It felt like he was living next to a friend. The following week, he got a small envelope in the mail. Inside was a printed flyer with the HOA's new schedule. At the bottom, in bold letters, it said, Community Volunteer Committee, organized by David and Linda. He laughed out loud. She hadn't even asked him first. But the idea was good. A committee that wasn't about rules or restrictions, but about connection. When he called her later that evening, she picked up on the first ring. I was wondering when you'd see it, she said, teasingly. You didn't waste time, he said. Well, she replied, you're the only one who can get this neighborhood to stop arguing long enough to actually do something. We're meeting next weekend. You in? He smiled. I'm in. The next few weeks were filled with planning. They organized small projects, repainting the park benches, helping an elderly couple fix their fence, collecting donations for a local food drive. And slowly, people started showing up to help. It wasn't everyone, but it was enough to make a difference. Every Saturday morning, a small group would gather at the park, laughing and chatting as they worked. David noticed how different things felt now. The tension that once filled the air was gone. Even Linda had changed. She was still firm when needed, but her tone was warmer, her smile easier. One morning, as they were cleaning up after painting the playground fence, she looked at him and said, "You know, if someone had told me a few months ago that I'd be spending my weekends painting fences with you, I would have called them crazy," he laughed. "Life's full of surprises." "Yeah," she said thoughtfully. "Good ones if you let them happen." The sound of laughter filled the air as kids came running past, leaving streaks of blue paint on their hands. It was messy but joyful. By the end of the day, when the sun started to set, the park looked brighter, not just from the new paint, but from the energy that had returned to the place. David stood back, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Looks good," he said. "Better than good," Linda said. "It feels alive again." As they packed up the tools, she looked at him with a small, genuine smile. "You know, I don't think I ever said thank you properly." He shook his head. "You don't need to." "I do," she insisted. "Not just for what you did for the neighborhood, but for giving me a chance to be better." David looked at her kindly. "We all need second chances. Even the people who seem like they don't," she smiled. "Even HOA board members?" "Especially them," he said, laughing. They walked home together in the fading light, the sound of crickets beginning to hum. It wasn't dramatic or grand, just peaceful, like things were finally in their right place. That night, as David sat on his porch watching the stars, he thought about how much could change with just one small act. A yard sale, a conversation, a shared cup of coffee. Sometimes, he thought, the best way to change people isn't by proving them wrong, but by showing them what right looks like. He leaned back in his chair, the night air cool against his skin, and smiled. This neighborhood, once filled with tension and silence, now buzzed with life, and it all started with one person deciding to do something kind, even when it wasn't easy. But what David didn't know yet was that something unexpected was about to happen, something that would test everything they had built, and soon, he'd have to prove once again who he really was. A few weeks passed, and the neighborhood had truly changed. What started as a tense, quiet street now felt full of life. People waved when they drove by. Kids played until sunset. Neighbors borrowed tools and actually returned them. David often smiled when he saw it all, not because he wanted credit, but because it reminded him of something he had missed for years, a sense of belonging. Every Saturday morning, the volunteer group met at the park. There was always something new to do, planting flowers, repainting signs, or just cleaning up trash. Linda was there every time, clipboard in hand, though she didn't use it to scold people anymore. Instead, she used it to make sure everyone had snacks and water. One Saturday, she walked up to David as he was unloading paint cans from his truck. "Guess what?" she said with a grin. "I'm afraid to," he said jokingly. "Last time you said that, I ended up building picnic tables." She laughed. "No building this time. We got a letter from the city." He raised an eyebrow. "That sounds serious. It's good," she said, waving the envelope. "They're recognizing our neighborhood for community improvement. There's going to be a small ceremony next weekend at City Hall." David blinked. "You're kidding." "Nope. Apparently someone nominated us anonymously." He smiled faintly. "Anonymous, huh? I wonder who that could have been." Linda gave him a knowing look but didn't say anything. "Anyway, they asked me to bring a few people to speak. And, well, I told them you'd be there." "Me?" he said, surprised. "Why me?" "Because you started this," she said simply. "Don't argue with me on this one," he laughed. "All right. But if I have to give a speech, you're helping me write it." "Deal," she said, smiling. All week, the neighborhood buzzed with excitement. People talked about the upcoming ceremony like it was a big event, which in a way it was. It wasn't about awards or attention. It was about pride. For the first time, everyone felt like they had done something together. On the morning of the ceremony, the weather was perfect. The sun was warm but gentle, and the sky was a soft, endless blue. Linda met David outside his house, holding a folder and looking more nervous than she wanted to admit. "Ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be," he said. "You?" "I've been on stage plenty of times," she said, "but never for something like this." They drove together to City Hall, where a small crowd had gathered. A few city officials stood on a raised platform, smiling and chatting with residents. A banner hung above them. Community Spirit Award. As they walked up, people greeted them warmly. David could tell that Linda was proud, not of herself, but of what everyone had built together. When it was their turn to speak, she nudged him toward the microphone. "You first," she whispered. He smiled, took a deep breath, and stepped up. "I'm not really a speech person," he began, "but I'll try my best." A few people chuckled softly. "When I moved into this neighborhood," he said, "I just wanted peace and quiet. I didn't expect to find community. I didn't expect to get to know so many good people. And I definitely didn't expect a yard sale to bring us all together." The crowd laughed warmly. He continued, "At first, not everyone agreed on how things should be done. We had some arguments, some misunderstandings. But that's part of being neighbors. What matters is that we found a way to listen to each other, to work together. And now look at us. We turned a quiet street into a family." He paused, looking over the crowd. "This isn't about one person. It's about all of us choosing kindness over conflict. And I think that's worth celebrating." People clapped, some even whistled when he stepped back.